It's really nice for you to come by today. I'm going to tell you the story about a man who wrote these words, and you know the words because you've used them. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I'm going to begin my lesson by telling you that man, the writer, his background, and who he was. His name was John Newton. He was born July the 24th, 1725, in London, England. He had a godly mother, but an irreligious seafaring father. His mother died when he was only 6 years of age. John Newton, as a result, never went to school in his whole lifetime. He lived on the streets of London, and he lived with the street gangs. The wrong crowd. He became a thief. He used to steal for groceries at the little local market. He had a reputation with the police. They all knew who he was. He ran like a fugitive, and he was a bit of a vagabond. Newton's mother was a very devout Anglican, and she taught her only child, John Newton, the Westminster Catechism. And before he'd go to bed at night, he would sing to her, or to sing to him, some beautiful hymns, the old hymns of the church. When she died, John Newton lost the anchor in his life. He grew up on those streets as a criminal. And in all his growing up years, he didn't spend one day in school. Self-taught, no formal education for his whole life. But at the age of 11, his father found him, and him being a sailor, he sent him out to sea with him. He made him a deckhand. And he made 5 voyages to the Mediterranean Sea before he was 18 years old. Later in life, he wrote this about his dad, describing his personality. I'm persuaded that my dad, I think, loved me, but he never told me. I was with him constantly there on the boat, but it was always in a state of fear and bondage. His sternness broke and overawed my spirit, so that I don't think, grew up to become a man. I really hated him, and if I could, I avoided him at all cost. Well, when John Newton was 17 years old, he met a young lady by the name of Mary Catlett, and he fell in love with her. But she was only 13 years old. But it was love at first sight, and he was smitten. And for the next 7 years, traveling all those wretchedness of the ocean, he dreamed about her every day. And she did the same about him. Here are his words from his diary. None of the scenes of misery and wickedness that I faced at sea as a deckhand ever banished. And not for a single moment did I ever forget and have no waking thoughts in those 7 years for my girlfriend. I had her in my heart every day. And they did eventually marry when he was 24 years. And they were married for 40 years until she died in 1790. His love for her was extraordinary before their marriage and even after their marriage. They had no children of their own. His wife had 2 little nieces who lost their parents, and she adopted them, and they became their children. At the age of 18, John Newton was pressed into naval service by his dad against his will. He didn't want to be a sea captain of a ship. He said his companions on board, whom he met, were the complete ruin of his whole life. All the principles that he had learned from his mother were forgotten there on that boat. He said, as a result of this, I was capable of anything. I didn't have the least fear of my mother's God, and I should have. I found that I had no conscience. My love for Mary was the only restraint that I had left. And when he was 20 years old, sailing down through South Africa, he was put off his ship and he was imprisoned in one of their prisons for a year and a half. After that period, he felt like he was a slave looking back, but he also found out that God was about to close in on him. God was going to find him and use him in his ministry. A passing ship saw some smoke coming from a building. It happened to be the prison where John Newton was living. That captain, seeing the smoke, anchored his boat, sent his crew ashore, and there they found John Newton, there in that prison. They took him out, carried him back on the boat, and to his surprise, that captain was a friend of his father, who was also a sea captain in another boat, but they knew each other. It was a slave ship carrying thousands of black slaves to America. That captain made him part of the crew. He sailed across the Atlantic a number of times. He experienced the cruelty firsthand now of what went on those slave ships. He had to feed those poor slaves who were down in the bottom of the boat, chained to the floor. And the ones that were sick and dying, he had to take them up on the deck and throw them overboard. But the ones that he looked after, they looked and they could see the kindness that he showed them when he fed them. And they in return gave him a sort of a tender smile of gratitude, even though they were chained to the floor. He kept marveling at the seemingly accidental way that ship had stopped by his prison, took him ashore, took him on the boat, and pressed him into service on that slave ship. He couldn't figure out why would that happen. That was not more than luck. There had to be something that made that happen. God was now going to move in on John Newton. His whole life is about to change. On his way home to England, after he had made a number of crossings on that Atlantic to the United States to drop off those slaves, March 21, 1748, God's going to rescue John Newton. He called himself the African blasphemer. He awoke that night in a violent storm on that boat. His room began to fill with water. He ran for the deck. The captain stopped him because the man ahead of him, he went out onto the deck and he was suddenly washed overboard. Newton was assigned the pumps. And he heard himself say, "If this doesn't work, God have mercy on my soul. I'm not going to live." It was the first time he ever expressed prayer in his life. He worked the pumps for 24 hours. He slept only a little bit of the time. And then he took the helm. The captain made him the captain, steering the boat in the middle of that storm. Well, the storm passed. The sea was now calm, but not his heart. The captain gave John Newton a Bible that he'd had on board in his own office. And he said, "Here's something I want to give you, Newton, as a bit of a Thanksgiving gift for keeping this ship afloat and saving our life." John Newton took the book. He had learned to read on his own on the streets in London. And as he read the book, what he found was God had an almighty Savior that he was going to now meet and be introduced to. He read the New Testament, and there he met Jesus. And he had an amazing conversion. He read John 14:6, when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me." John Newton found his salvation through a Bible that the captain gave him almost as a joke. And he read it. And by the reading, the Holy Spirit led that man to himself. He found the pardonable love of Jesus. And his whole life now found a new tenderness and a new gentleness that he never had before. And from that moment on, he found it very easy to forgive others because he himself had been forgiven. Having been brought safely through so many dangers, he said, I was so sorry for my past misspent life. I was happy to be freed from that habit of swearing. Every other word that came out of his lips was a swear word. He didn't swear anymore. And to all appearances, he said, I became a brand new man. Well, he married Mary February the 1st, 1750. And that's June. He heard that his father had drowned at sea in an accident at sea. Well, what did he do? He wasn't going back to sea again. He'd had enough sailing. He had seen enough slaves. He didn't agree with the way the British government had permitted slavery to be part of their mercantile GOP, selling them to the Americans. He became a surveyor of tides, living in Liverpool, working the shores, getting the tides up and down and doing their mark. He began attending church. He became an evangelical lay leader in his church. One day he went to hear the Billy Graham of his day. His name was George Whitefield. And through his message, he heard the call to the ministry. He devoted himself to the program of self-study. He felt that sooner or later, God was going to call him and use him in ministry. If he's going to do it, he better know his Bible. So he began to learn and memorize his Bible. And by the early 1760s, John Newton felt the call to ministry. He accepted a call to a little Anglican church, a little parish in Olney, Olney, a little town in central England. He pastored that church for the next 16 years. And then at the age of 54, he was called to his final church, St. Mary's Church in London, England, where he's going to serve for the next 27 years till he retires. He preached his last sermon at St. Mary's, October 1806. He was 81 years old. Mary died 17 years before John died. Let me tell you John Newton of what his secret was in his pastoring. He practiced what he called habitual tenderness. He became a shepherd to his sheep, and he did it for 40 years. And for him, habitual tenderness was his own phrase describing the way that a believer should live and teach others to believe. He believed and felt that his own weakness and unworthiness made him the pastor, and he had the whole life to prove it, because he'd lived on the streets in London, and he then called himself the African blasphemer, the best sinner that ever came out of Africa, becoming a slave. He lived out his life upon grace and the pardoning love of his Lord. His love for people was a signature of his life. He loved his own flock of redeemed people. Here was his motto: if you have tasted the love of Christ and experienced redemption, you'll have no trouble loving your other fellow creatures. It was said that he loved them first sight. Here's an example. John Newton, when he took over his charge at Olney for his first service, he began by starting a Sunday school. He began meeting children, and finally that Sunday school grew to 200. He told them Bible stories. He told them his story, how he became a Christian. And he also told them all those ugly memories that he had being the captain of a slave ship. The children that came to this class, they weren't Christians. They didn't even go to church. Their parents didn't go to church. He found them on the street. He was good at that because he lived on the street. He told them the seafaring adventures. And the kids, as they listened to him, they were riveted by what he said. Now comes one of John Newton's greatest gifts. Not only was he a great orator and preacher, he was also a poet. Remember, he had congregations for 43 years in Olney in London. Devoted husband. For 40 years, he lived with that lady until she died. He was also a great poet. Here's the part I want to tell you about. When he'd do his visitation and he'd see a sick one in bed, he would write them a personal poem describing their condition and also their future if they became a Christian. And he did that with everybody he met. Are you a poet? Have you ever written poetry? Well, anyway, this man was faithful until he dies. And I'm going to conclude this talk by giving you one of the greatest poems that man ever wrote. When I was in high school, I took Latin. Did you ever study Latin? Well, don't. It's one of the most boring languages you'll ever get. I did it for 3 years. I was the only boy in a class of 12 girls. And you know, when I had to take that class, one of the things we had to do at the end, our teacher made us go to the blackboard and we had to write some kind of poetry that we had written in class that others would enjoy, just practicing our Latin. Well, I went to the board and I began to write. And here's what I wrote. Remember, I sat at the back of the class, probably bored out of my skull most of the time. I did pass, but I didn't enjoy studying Latin as a subject at high school. Here's what I wrote on the board. Boebus licebus sweetum grolorum, grolibus licebus wanum samorum. Pater puella enter parlorum, exibus dorum. He read them out. I wrote that on the board. Nobody understood what I said, and neither did I. That's how much I remember of Latin. John Newton didn't have that problem. When he would visit his sheep, he practiced John 10. He called his sheep by name, and they followed him. And when he would write them a poem, they would keep it almost like a Hallmark card beside their bed, because they knew it was something very personal from him as their pastor, teaching them as a shepherd how I'm to obey and how I'm to believe as one of his lambs. New Year's Eve, 1760. Something happened. He preached his last sermon. When he preached his last sermon, he had a feeling of overcoming remorse and shame for the life that he had lived. He never forgot that. He remembered all those early days growing up, how bad he was. On that last night, when he preached his sermon, he concluded his sermon by telling the little congregation his testimony. Do you know how he did that? He wrote them a poem. He didn't know that this poem was one day going to become a hymn, and it's going to be sung in every language all over the world, and even the greatest orchestras on earth are going to play that melody to that wonderful hymn. Well, what did he write? Here was his testimony at the end of that sermon, that New Year's Eve, there in his church in London. Amazing grace, how great the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. He went on. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and buckler be, as long as life endures. And now he tells a bit of his story. When he was a sea captain, through many dangers and toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. And now he concludes. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we have no less days to sing his praise than when we had first begun. If you were sitting in that congregation that night in London, those 200 years ago, and you heard a man say that, would you be affected by what he said? I would. I don't sing that hymn that I don't think of John Newton and his background and how it came to be that he wrote that beautiful word that all of us have come to love. So the next time you're singing the hymn, think about what I've just said. And in thinking about it, if this man who had no education and God had spoken to him, rescued him from the most horrible job he could ever have, being a captain of a slave ship, taking young children to their destiny away across the ocean and never seeing their parents again or their background. That man, if God could touch his hand and use him, I wonder what he'll do for you. Have you ever thought of that? As we begin this whole new year of 2026, I want you to think about that. Lord, what would you have me do this year? If he could do that with no education, you've given me a wonderful education, wonderful friends, great teachers. I've got that inside me now. Would you help me spring it loose and share it with somebody else? That's my topic. That's my message. His favorite word that he had: trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. And then in the New Testament, John Newton had this as his favorite verse. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by me. That became his watchword and motto that he lived and practiced with his wife all his days. Make it yours. Okay, that's enough for today. See you next week when you come back.